So, last class, we did the first half of chapter 17, which focused on the limitations of freedoms in America at the end of the 19th century. Looked at specifically the hardships of workers. We looked at specifically at the hardships of farmers, and we finished off with a concentration on segregation in the South, the loss of the right to vote, the loss of equal rights of citizenship, Jim Crow segregation in the South, lynchings, etc., etc. Now, the second half of chapter 17 looks at more broadly this consequence of America is moving in the direction of limiting the freedoms of the poor, the working class, and minorities. Why is it happening? And how does it manifest itself more broadly, not just in the treatment of peoples, but in broad policy in general? The first thing I want to look at is contrasting notions of nationhood. What does that mean? In this period where unions were being broken, farmers were being exploited, blacks were being lynched, in addition to Chinese and Mexicans, and believe it or not, even Italian Americans were being lynched down in Louisiana for reasons I've yet to understand. I think it's because they were Catholic and different. There was a discussion that was developing over who belongs. Who belongs? Who deserves the right of citizenship? Because at a certain point, when you are excluding all these people from equal protection under the law, the equal ability to make a decent living wage, somebody somewhere is thinking this is okay to do. And it's not just racism or class elitism. That's all part of it. But increasingly, the part of the bigger question that is being answered, even if subtly and quietly, some people deserve to be Americans, and some people just should work and shut up. They shouldn't complain if they have to live in the crappy neighborhoods, take the crappy jobs, and don't have the same opportunities as others. Who belongs to the American nation? The American nation are its people. So, at this time, what you had is this broad idea that the only people that deserve the blessings of freedom and liberty, which are guaranteed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, are white Anglo-Saxon Americans. Not blacks, not the poor, not the Chinese, not organized labor, and certainly not the millions upon millions of immigrants coming from Italy, Greece, Russia, Poland, Jews, Catholics, etc. This all gave rise to what's known as the new nativism. Nativism is the belief that America belongs to its natives, the people already here. Now, I know it sounds like Native Americans, but no, they're never part of the conversation. The new nativism was the most recent flowering of anti-immigrant sentiment in America. And the reason it's called the new nativism is it's not the first time or the last time that Americans have freaked out over the most recent wave of immigrants that have come to the country. In the late 1700s, when the Irish were coming over, that concerned the already settled English or Anglo-Americans. In the 1840s, when millions upon millions of Irish came over because of the Great Famine back in Ireland, that led to an organized political party that was all about keeping the immigrants out. So all these Irish that you see in the New York City Fire Department, Police Department, Boston Police Department, and they're all part of the American political fabric. There was a time when they came, they were considered the same way that the worst of the worst stereotypes are used on contemporary immigrants in this country. And you might be thinking, I don't get it, they're white. What's the discrimination? They were Catholic as opposed to Protestant. They were poor, illiterate, poorly educated, and the belief was they simply couldn't become good Americans because they didn't know about American systems of government. They couldn't think independently, etc. The same thing that is being used against all immigrants. When they come over, the belief is you can never really be a full American because of fill in the blanks. This new nativism was targeted at all the new immigrants coming at the end of the 19th century to America. I'm talking about the Italians, I'm talking about the Greeks, the Eastern Europeans, Russians, Polish, etc. Many of them were Catholic, but the Eastern Europeans were mostly Jews. Remember, America is still a predominantly Protestant country. So Catholic and Jew back then was different. The way we would consider, not we, but the way some people would consider Islam different. Not part of mainstream American culture today. Back then, it was Catholicism and Judaism, which was considered different. All right? As you can see, American bigotry is a moving goalpost. Now, these people that came over were targeted the same way that immigrants are targeted today, and were targeted the same way that immigrants were targeted 100 years earlier. They don't speak the language. They're of a different religion, a different culture. They're never going to assimilate. How can they be Americans? And this was targeted towards the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, Russians, etc., etc. But even worse, they were considered to be a lower race. Like at their core, at their DNA core, doesn't matter if they learned English, doesn't matter if they changed their clothes, but at their core, they are inferior to white Anglo-Saxons. They're never going to be as good as. So all of a sudden, that whole melting pot of American history, that everyone comes here and they all become American, that is slowly going out the window. It's increasingly being limited who people think can become, quote-unquote, real Americans. And if you don't consider them real Americans or proper citizens, you don't have to pay them the same amount of money. You don't have to respect their right to vote, their right to good housing, good jobs, etc. That's the step from bigotry to legalized segregation and discrimination. So at this time, there was a variety of plans to curtail immigration. There was a group called the Immigration Restriction League that nationally organized that demanded only people that could read can apply for citizenship, which at the time was targeting poor immigrants who came from countries where they didn't have access to education. That was on purpose. Moreover, not just nationally, but individually, the states started making it harder and harder for immigrants to become citizens, to get the vote, to simply become assimilated, no matter how hard they tried. The most egregious or the worst case of legalized discrimination, after you take into account what was being done to blacks in the South, state by state, taking away their rights to equality, their right to vote, was done against the Chinese. Now, again, discrimination against the Chinese might seem a little new to you. Because when we talk about race in this country, we talk about black and white. Recently, it's been more Latinos and how they are being discriminated against. And Latinos is a bit of a misnomer, because Puerto Ricans are not Mexicans, they're not Dominicans, they're not Guatemalans. But in the eyes of the bigot, it's all Latinos. Now, but think about the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington State, which is on the other side of the Pacific to China. Those immigrants that left China, the poor immigrants that left China, they're not going to come to America and then keep going to New York. Many did, but a lot of them stopped as soon as they hit land in California. So California's immigrant population was Chinese. The fear of immigrants was directed against the Chinese. And it was big enough, and California was big enough, that it led to not just state action against the Chinese, but congressional or national policy against the Chinese. For instance, in 1875, Congress passed a law that said no more Chinese women could immigrate to America, because if they came and they met Chinese men, they would have families and settle down, because all children born in America are automatically American citizens. So how do you want to limit that? Well, you make sure women don't come over. In 1882, Congress went further and said, temporarily, we're not allowing any Chinese to come to America for any reason. And then in 1902, that was made permanent. No Chinese immigrants are allowed in America. Of course, if the government starts passing laws against Chinese immigrants, they're sending a message that the Chinese are not welcome, those here do not deserve respect, and as a consequence, mob violence against the Chinese on the West Coast went up at the same time that mob violence was going up against the blacks in the South. In the face of this organized discrimination, this organized racism, leaders of the African American community, leaders of labor organizing groups recognized the chips were stacked against them. When you have the entire United States government, state, national, and the Supreme Court all saying it's okay to take the vote away from blacks, to segregate blacks from whites, as well as Chinese from whites and Mexicans from whites, depending on what state we're talking to, there's really no room for civil rights activism. There are no allies left over. Booker T. Washington, who was the recognized leader of the organized African American community at the end of the 19th century, recognized if there was going to be any improvement in the economic condition of blacks in the country, now, and I'm talking about the 1890s, 1890s specifically, now is not the time to organize, unionize, and challenge the power structure, because the power structure was uniformly against black activism. So Booker T. Washington emphasized, stop fighting for equal rights, because you're not going to get any. Focus on economic self-improvement, self-help, individual advancement into the middle class. Don't fight against white employers by joining unions of white workers, which didn't want you in the first place, but try and find a working relationship with white employers, get that money, save it, raise up the community, move yourself into the middle class. And by all means, do not engage in political agitation. Don't start registering voters. Don't start giving political speeches, because all you're going to do is bring the hammer down on yourself and your community. And no one's going to get arrested when they start lynching you. So just work, shut up, save your money, and advance yourself individually. Now, this may not seem like the most adventurous policy, but everything that happened afterwards, with the foundation of the National Advancement for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where blacks became far more organized within 20 years and started taking civil rights cases to the Supreme Court and winning. All of that happened from this cadre of well-educated, the black middle class that Booker T. Washington was struggling to develop at the end of the 19th century. In the labor movement, there was also a scaling back of dreams of equality. The previous big union, the Knights of Labor, was well organized, huge, successful. They managed to go on strike and force a national law that recognized workers, if they worked more than 8 hours a day, had to get paid overtime. But those unions were smashed at the end of the 1880s. At this point, a new union arose, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. These guys were far less violent and far more picky in who they wanted in their union. They were not interested in campaigning for political office. They were not interested in organization. They were not interested in violent strikes to force employers to back down, because the last time that happened, the police and the military was called out and people died. And nobody was helping out the workers. Instead, this guy, Samuel Gompers, who led the AFL, like Booker T. Washington, emphasized, find something that you can work with your employers. Don't challenge them, find some sort of something common to improve the condition of workers. But the AFL was not organizing all workers, like the Knights of Labor. They organized skilled workers, higher paid workers, who had much more leverage because they had a skill which the employers wanted to keep in their factories or shops. They also did not organize black workers or women workers. They only focused on white, skilled workers. So if you happen to be a black worker in the North, no union would have you. If you happen to be a woman working, no union would have you. It would take another 10 to 15 years before that group of unrepresented people finally got representation. This period also saw this contradictory development for women. On the one hand, in the 1890s, women became far more independent, white women, in this country than they've ever been before. If you've taken my U.S. History Part 1 class, you would have known that in the 1840s, before the American women's rights movement, women didn't have access to their own wages. They couldn't sign contracts in their own names. The law didn't recognize them as an individual. If a woman committed a crime, her father or husband would have to be responsible, as if the woman were a child. There was, of course, no access to education, upper-level education, skilled work, and, of course, the vote. By the 1890s, things improved substantially for women. For instance, they were much more prevalent in public life. They were joining more organizations, more committees, charitable groups. They had positions of influence in society. They now were able to control their wages and property and sign contracts on their own, which gave them significant economic independence. You could find women now in social clubs, temperance associations, which are groups that try to curb drinking, because the belief is drinking leads to alcoholism, which leads to domestic violence, as well as spending all your money on liquor, which keeps poor families consistently poor and, women beaten up. Women were all over the place in terms of massively organized national reform organizations. And by this point, women were much more strident in demanding the right to vote. But even in the American women's suffrage movement, the movement that pushed for the vote, it was a very elite group. They were not organizing black women. They were not organizing poor women. And they were not organizing recent immigrant women, Chinese, Italian, Greek, Russian, Jewish, whatever. Even in this movement of women that was struggling for its own voice and its own equality, even they took the tack that quote-unquote true Americans were white Anglo-Saxon people of descent. So, the next thing I want to talk about is this rather aggressive Anglo-Saxon pride and narrow definition of what true Americanism is. How did it represent itself on the global stage? Well, here's the connection. If people in power feel that some people are deserving of liberty, rights, etc., and many others are not, many others can be consigned to second-class status. If you can do that at home, how easy would it be to reduce to second-class status people from another country, from another culture, to take away their independence? If you're doing it at home to American blacks, American Italians, American Jews, etc., how easy would that be to do it to the Chinese in China, the Filipinos in the Philippines, the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans? The answer is it's very easy. If you convince yourself that you are the best and you have a right to impose your culture on others at home, well, then it's easy to do it overseas. And by this point, America was a military and economic powerhouse. The Industrial Revolution that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, it didn't just produce a lot of factories and a lot of cities. It produced a globally powerful military machine, a professional army, a professional and expanding navy. America could propel its military power across the world. And they did. Why did they do it? The reason they did it was multi-layered. There was, of course, the moral imperative, which was America, being a superior, white, Anglo-Saxon Christian nation, must civilize other inferior peoples. That's how they talked. I'm not making this up. Other people who believed in imperialism, the conquest of other territories, had a much more naked economic argument. The American economy is expanding. We need access to overseas markets that we control. And so we have to grab that territory and make it part of the American empire. And then others simply said, strategically, America needs an empire. We have global trade. We need to set up military bases around the world to protect our global trade. We need bases in the Pacific, the Caribbean, everywhere to protect American trade. This is an idea of the American empire by 1900. Here's the American homeland. This are the Caribbean islands that were taken over, Puerto Rico, Cuba. In the Pacific, Hawaii was taken in 1898. Midway, Wake Islands, Guam. Even earlier, these smaller islands here in the 1850s, American Samoa, and here's the Philippines. So most of that territory in the Pacific was taken during the last decade of the 19th century, the 1890s, where America set up naval bases across the Pacific, which meant American trade could go across the Pacific, and if it was ever interfered with, there would be a naval base in Hawaii, bases in the Philippines, etc., to reach out and punish the person that interfered. Same thing in the Caribbean. I'll get to this in a moment, but as you all know, Puerto Rico was essentially made a colony, if not called that. Cuba was made independent, but we maintained a base at Guantanamo Bay, which we still have today. And we had invaded virtually every country in Latin America in the 20th century. Virtually every country. Grenada, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, El Salvador. We invaded, or we just supported a repressive regime? Right. What else? So that's the actual invaded countries, but that's another story. All right. So let's start off with Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. How did that happen? How did we end up with Hawaii, and how did it end up becoming a state? Well, Hawaii had already had a whole lot of Americans living there before Hawaii was made part of America in 1898. Other Americans did trade there. There were military agreements with the Hawaiians. There was a base at Pearl Harbor, which still exists today. In Hawaii, American sugar growers had many plantations. The territory was great for growing sugar. And so the Americans depended on a friendly Hawaiian government to allow them to own all that Hawaiian land to grow sugar and to be able to hire Hawaiian citizens. But this relationship, as comfortable as it was, eventually the American planters in Hawaii wanted more control, and not just a friendly relationship with the Hawaiian government, but actual control of Hawaii. In 1893, the American plantation class in Hawaii rebelled against the Hawaiian monarchy. The Americans sent in the Marines to protect American citizens and their trade. And after 1893, Hawaii was basically a possession of America, no longer an independent nation. From this point forward, there is an aggressive nationalism in America, where taking Hawaii whet the appetite of Americans who wanted more. More bases in the Pacific, more territory in the Caribbean. A lot of it had to do with the desire for foreign markets, which I already mentioned before. The 1890s, the Great Depression, this is the depression that drove down farm prices and was killing the farmers at home. The solution to the Great Depression was, we need more markets to sell American goods, markets we can control. So let's conquer lands overseas. Other reasons for the growth of this nationalism was division at home. Throughout American history, whenever we have division at home, racial division, religious division, class or wealth division, the one thing that brings Americans together is war. The fear of being accused of being unpatriotic will scare anybody into silence, at least for the first few months. And we've seen in our own lifetime. After 9/11, before 9/11, President George W. Bush had a very, very low approval rating. After 9/11 and the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, his approval rating was astronomically high in the 80s and 90s, or very high. It came down again, but it took a couple of years. So at this time, when you have this flood of immigrants coming into the country and the fear that they're not going to assimilate to American culture, you've got racial division across the country. There is this belief that imperialism, the pride taken in conquering other territories, will bind Americans together. And for a while it worked. This is the era of the Pledge of Allegiance, which you hear at the beginning of, well, a lot of functions. The national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the celebration of the American flag, all common symbols and songs. The only reason we have these things is so that we all have something in common. For those of you that went to school in the United States, for high school and elementary school, did you have to listen to the national anthem at the beginning of class? Yeah? Right. Or, exactly. The national anthem before every sporting event. This is not an accident. Patriotism is a taught feeling. You don't come out of your mother's womb saying, I'm proud to be an American. You are taught that. It's even more difficult when people come later in life. How do you teach those folks, the immigrants, patriotism for an adopted culture? There's a point to this. Finally, what's known as yellow journalism pretty much kicked up the new imperialism, the conquest of territories. What is yellow journalism? Yellow journalism is the National Enquirer of its time. Inexpensive newspapers with sensational stories, lots of pictures, that are not interested in fair and balance. They're interested in getting your attention and buying a copy of the newspaper. And because the paper was so inexpensive and of poor quality, it was either printed on yellow paper or tended to become yellow very quickly. The next test for this new aggressive American military prowess was against Spain. Spain once was a magnificent empire. The Spanish sailed around Africa before many other Europeans did, although not as early as the Chinese did. They colonized all of South America, minus Brazil, all of Central America, and at a certain point, all of Western United States of America. All of it colonized by the Spanish, including all the Caribbean islands, minus the obvious ones like Jamaica and so on and so forth. And thus, all those territories are Spanish-speaking and Catholic. That is not an accident. But all this happened in the 1500s, the 14 and 1500s. By 1898, Spain is exhausted as an empire. It has lost much of its empire. The only thing it's got left, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and a couple of other little islands. Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, had been in a struggle against Spain for independence for years. The Spanish crushed the Cuban independence movements brutally. The stories of that destroyed movement appeared in the American press. And Americans had a lot of sympathy with Cubans because to them, the Cubans were a North American people struggling against a European power, just like the Americans struggled against Britain, I guess it would be 100 years earlier, 120 years earlier. So there was a lot of sympathy for the Cubans. In 1898, we got involved in the Spanish-Cuban conflict. Why? On February 15th, 1898, the United States battleship Maine, M-A-I-N-E, blew up in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. Now, at the time, the press wrote about the Spanish had targeted American military vessels and destroyed them. But they had no proof of that. Later on, we discovered that the USS Maine, it simply blew up because it had a bad boiler. But the press said, because of all that tension against the Spanish, it was the Spanish that did it. So all of a sudden, Americans want revenge. Remember after 9/11, we had to kick somebody's ass. So we went to Afghanistan because they were actually, hiding out. The Taliban was hiding out Osama bin Laden. But somebody had to pay for 9/11, and somebody had to pay for the destruction of the USS Maine. War fever gripped the country. Congress was flooded with letters and notes from people who were reading these stories in the press saying, we've got to do something to avenge the Maine. And Congress are the ones that declare war. The president's the commander-in-chief, but Congress has to declare war and pay for it. And they did. In April, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The war against Spain was quick, very quick, because America was a modern military power and Spain was an exhausted old imperial power. The war only lasted 4 months. And in those 4 months, the Americans captured the Philippines, they captured Cuba, they captured Puerto Rico. Spain was eliminated as an imperial power in 4 months. After that, the only territory Spain had was the homeland of Spain and a couple of islands in the Mediterranean. Now, this is some of the stuff that you would see in the press at the time. First off, you want to depict the Spanish as animals. And with like dangerous animals, the only solution is to destroy them. So this is the kind of stuff that you would see in the press. The Spanish, as you can see, Spain written across the belt. Bloody hands, the knife, dead soldiers in the back, brutally killed. A tombstone for the Maine sailors murdered by Spain. And of course, looking like an animal, a dark animal, never a light-colored animal, because historically, dark has always been associated with dangerous. Okay? Now, main explosion caused by bomb or torpedo? Question mark. There was no suspicion that it was, in fact, purposely sunk, but the question was asked because of all the tension with Spain, and people, seeing this picture of the sinking battleship, just assumed it was on purpose, and somebody had to pay. And finally, I don't know if you can see this, but it says, Spaniards search women on American steamers. The story here was that women, remember, women are always considered fragile to be protected. Code of manhood is to protect your women. Spaniards were seizing American ships, steamers, and searching women, obviously disrobing them. Thus, this was an attack on American manhood. And somebody had to pay. This is what I mean by yellow journalism. There isn't a whole lot of high enlightened debate. It's all about shock so that you go off and do something. So, once again, back to the map. The United States, they've already got Hawaii, they took over some other islands from Spain, Guam, Wake, the Philippines, and of course, the Caribbean islands, Cuba, Puerto Rico. Now, very immediately, America went from being the liberator of the territories from Spain to being, in the eyes of the people that were quote-unquote liberated, just as bad as a conqueror. For instance, 1898, Hawaii is formally annexed. It's now taken as part of the American Empire. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam are all taken from Spain, but they're not given independence. They are not given independence. Guam, American military base. The Philippines, part of the empire. Puerto Rico, part of the empire, not independent. Cuba was the most obvious example that America was building an empire. They gave the Cubans independence, but they insisted on keeping a base at Guantanamo Bay, at which today we still have Marines. Even in China, the Americans flexed their muscle. Now that they could project their military power around the world, China was a large but weak nation, and other nations were trying to get into the Chinese market to sell things to the Chinese people. The Americans were feared being left out. Let me just show you a map real quick. This is China right here. It's basically the size of the United States. The Americans wanted access to the Chinese market, basically like the way we want today. They essentially demanded, and other nations followed because they saw the rising power of America, that all nations should have open access to the Chinese market, which was not the way it was going beforehand. What happened? Well, the Filipinos, who had fought for independence against Spain, were now understandably upset that now they were living under American colonial rule. So they rose up in rebellion. And how do we handle it? Very poorly. The U.S. sent in troops to crush the Filipino rebellion. And it turned into something akin to the Vietnam War 50, 60 years later. We dumped in troops after troops after troops to fight a jungle war, and the only way to win is to simply massacre the other side and convince them to not fight. At the end of the Filipino War of 1899 to 1903, 100,000 Filipinos were dead, and 4,200 American soldiers. The barbarity of the American soldiers to crush the Filipino uprising, to set an example that if you rise up against the Americans, there will be swift and thorough punishment, was out of control. At the end, the Philippines were in many ways turned into what Hawaii was, a place where U.S. large landowners took all the good land and did well. They established low-wage plantations. They took up all the good land, hired the Filipinos at poverty prices, poverty wages, and they made all the money. What they left, the Americans, was a legacy of poverty. Not enough ability to make money, save their wages because they were paid so low, no access to land, basically the condition of blacks in the South of the United States. This is some of the photos I found rather easily of the Filipino War. Civilians and soldiers massacred by large numbers and buried in huge trenches, burial grounds, and waterboarding. Do you remember the great scandal over torture in this country about 3-4 years ago, when we were on the hunt for bin Laden and stories were coming out that suspected terrorists were being held in these secret bases out of America, where the CIA was conducting basically torture to get them to say whatever it was they could say to lead us to find other terrorists, and especially bin Laden. The most effective torture device that we heard about was waterboarding, which was essentially simulating drowning, making it seem like you're drowning and scaring the bejesus out of you until eventually you'll just say anything. That wasn't invented during the last 5 years. This is waterboarding. You put a cloth over the person's face, you pour water down there, and it simulates drowning. This man was tortured so that he would say where his allies were. This appeared in the Boston Sunday Globe on March 5th, 1899, in the middle of the Filipino War. And the goal here is to show, once a savage, now a member of America. You can take him from this, make him into an American. As a savage, he had some abilities, but he can put them to work as a baseball player. I think my favorite one is this one. As a savage, his old habit of running amok, running without any purpose, just running all over the place, will add greatly on the football field. And this one here is kind of fun. From the war dance to the cakewalk, this is the type of dance they were doing, is but a short step. All of this is meant to justify the savagery of the war in the Philippines. We are civilizing these people, even if we have to kill 100,000 of them to teach them how to be civilized. Now, all of these people that came in, Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, residents of Guam, Wake Island, all of these people, the question was, well, now that you're part of the American Empire, are you a citizen or not? From the very beginning, the decision was made not. The Constitution does not apply specifically to you. You are subjects of the American Empire. You are not citizens. And the Supreme Court upheld this claim. All right? a debate did begin. Should we be doing this to these people? The people against it said, quite simply, we're the nation that says we believe in equality, blah, 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 blah. How can we possibly justify the conquest and exploitation of foreign peoples? We're supposed to be the place that everyone looks to as an example of liberty and equality. But the supporters of imperialism simply said, you know what? It doesn't matter. People need to be civilized, and we're the ones to do it. And by the way, we're an expanding economy. We need markets. Either we take this land or somebody else will. End of story. And by the way, not everybody deserves liberty, equality, the Constitution. So I don't want to hear about your complaints about how we treat the Hawaiians, the Filipinos, the Cubans, the Puerto Ricans. So at the end of the 1800s, what do we have? America is an industrial giant. It is now quickly becoming the most powerful industrial nation in the world. But what else is it by 1900? The corporations dominate the economy. Workers and farmers can't get a fair shake. Government is taken over by the wealthy. There is increasing division between rich and poor. There is increasing division between whites and everybody else because of this exploitive nature of the relationship. There is increasing anti-immigration sentiment, or nativism. And people are increasingly asking the question, where do we go from here? What is this relationship between economic and political liberty? Remember what I was talking about last class? That there's many different definitions of liberty. There's the leave me alone definition, don't tell me what to do. That's the negative liberty. Stay out of my way, don't tax me, don't tell me what to do. Then there's a positive liberty. People need help, education, welfare, whatever, so they have some economic independence. And increasingly, you have this discussion. Government's got to do something about the rampant poverty in this country, because real liberty cannot be had if you are economically enslaved. And so, what is the government supposed to do? Is it supposed to hang back and just let business run everything? Or not? Remember the populists. They said government's got to kick in and got to get involved, buy the railroads, etc. That idea doesn't go away just because the Populist Party disappears. And finally, when you have all these millions upon millions of new immigrants coming, this question of who gets to be a citizen can't be ignored. How are you going to treat these millions of people coming over? So this takes us to the beginning of the 20th century, and it's a wild ride from this point forward. So, any questions about any of this?